The city of Chicago in the 1920s was not merely a metropolis of steel and concrete, it was a living, breathing organism consumed by a fever. The symptoms of this infection were evident on every street corner, vibrating through the pavement and hanging in the heavy, industrial air. It was found in the frantic, syncopated jazz spilling out of the underground speakeasies, in the roar of custom-built V8 engines tearing down Michigan Avenue, and in the sharp, staccato rhythm of the Thompson submachine gun that had become the city's unofficial soundtrack. It was a time of excess, a time of prohibition, and a time where lawlessness was the only law that mattered. At the center of this fever stood one man. He was a figure of mythical proportions, a man whose shadow stretched across the entire nation. To the newspapers, hungry for headlines, he was public enemy number one, a celebrity gangster who dressed in pastel suits and tipped waiters with $100 bills. To the federal government, specifically the Treasury Department and the FBI, he was a cancer growing in the heart of America, a symbol of the failure of the justice system. But to the people of the South Side, and most importantly, to the quiet, unassuming woman waiting in a brick bungalow on Prairie Avenue, he was simply Snorky, or Al. Al Capone was a man of profound and terrifying duality. He was a paradox wrapped in a silk suit. He could order the execution of a rival with a subtle nod of his head, condemning a man to death while eating a plate of spaghetti, and in the same hour, he could be found weeping openly at the opera, moved to tears by an aria. He was a savage warlord who built an empire on bootlegged whiskey, gambling, prostitution, and blood, yet he was terrified of one thing above all else, the safety of his family. For Capone, the world was divided into two distinct spheres, the business, which was a shark tank of betrayal and violence, and the home, which was sacred ground. His wife, May Capone, and their son, Sonny, were the only pure things in a life defined by corruption. They were the sanctuary where the blood didn't reach. May was his anchor to humanity, the one person who looked at him and saw a husband rather than a monster. And in the spring of 1929, that sanctuary was under siege. The underworld does not tolerate kings for long. It is a predatory ecosystem where weakness is death and ambition is a disease. Jealousy is the currency of the Mafia, and by 1929, the exchange rate was skyrocketing. Capone had just orchestrated the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre in February, eliminating the North Side gang in a hail of bullets. He thought he had cleared the board. He thought he was untouchable. But while Al Capone smiled for the newsreel cameras and opened soup kitchens to feed the unemployed, wolves were circling his door. But these weren't the obvious enemies. These weren't the remnants of the Bugs Moran crew or the federal agents tapping his phones. These were wolves he had fed. These were wolves he had invited into his home, men he had embraced and called brothers. The threat wasn't coming from across the street, it was coming from his own table. And when Al Capone discovered that the betrayal threatened to leave his wife and son defenseless in a city of sharks, the monster inside him didn't just wake up. It broke its chains. What followed was one of the most brutal displays of power in criminal history, a night that would become legend in the annals of American crime. But while the world knows about the violence, while the world knows about the baseball bat and the blood on the floor, they often overlook the most chilling part of the story. They overlook what happened when the door closed, and the warlord went home. They overlook the reaction of the woman who shared his bed. The Mafia threatened Al Capone's family, and he slaughtered them for it. But what his wife, May, did next was not scream, and it was not run. It was something far more unimaginable. It was an act of silence that echoed louder than any gunshot. To understand the rage of Al Capone, one must first understand the depth of the betrayal. By early 1929, Capone was arguably the most powerful criminal in the world. He had consolidated power, eliminated rivals, and bought off nearly half the Chicago police force. Judges were on his payroll, politicians were in his pocket. But heavy lies the crown. Within the Chicago outfit, distinct factions were forming, and ambition was brewing like a storm. Two men, in particular, had grown tired of living in Capone's shadow. Albert Anselmi and John Scalise were not ordinary soldiers. They were hitmen of the highest caliber, known across the underworld as the Murder Twins. They were Sicilian nationals, steeped in the old-world traditions of the Black Hand. They were feared for their brutality. Legend had it they would rub garlic on their bullets so that if the shot didn't kill you, the infection would. They had saved Capone's life in the past. They had done his dirty work. They were trusted. They were considered family. But loyalty in the mob is often leased, not owned. Enter Joseph, the Toad Junta, the ambitious and conniving head of the Unione Siciliana. Junta saw an opportunity. He approached the twins with a proposition that appealed to their vanity and their greed. He whispered poison in their ears. He told them that Capone was too flashy, too American, too reckless. He argued that Capone's high-profile antics were bringing too much heat on the organization. He told them that the true power should belong to the Sicilians, the men of tradition. But the real selling point wasn't ideology, it was money and power. A secret alliance had been formed with Joe Aiello, a bitter rival of Capone who had placed a $50,000 bounty on AL's head, a fortune in 1929. The plan they hatched was simple, devastating, and intimate. They would kill Al Capone themselves. They would get close to him, using their status as trusted lieutenants, and cut off the head of the snake. With Capone gone, the empire would crumble, and they would pick up the pieces. This wasn't just a business move. In the world of organized crime, when a boss falls, the rules of engagement often shift. His biological family loses their protection. Without Al, May and Sonny would be vulnerable targets. They could be kidnapped for ransom, extorted for hidden cash reserves, or eliminated simply to scrub the Capone name from the earth. The plotters didn't just want the throne, they were willing to burn down the castle and everyone inside it to get it. They were gambling with the lives of a woman and a child who had never fired a gun. Capone, however, was not a man who walked blindly. He had survived this long because he was paranoid, and he thrived because he was smarter than the thugs who worked for him. He had eyes everywhere, doormen, waiters, beat cops, and loyal soldiers embedded in other crews. Rumors of the defection reached him. At first, he didn't want to believe it. Scalise and Anselmi were his boys. He had protected them from the law when they faced murder charges. He had made them rich. He had treated them with a generosity that was rare in their world. But the evidence mounted. A bodyguard noticed a hushed conversation that stopped abruptly when Capone entered the room. A message was intercepted. The final confirmation likely came from Frank Nitti or another loyalist who had feigned interest in the coup only to report back to the boss. The realization hit Capone like a physical blow. It wasn't just treason, it was fratricide. It was a rejection of his love. The psychological impact on Capone was profound. He viewed himself as a benevolent father figure to his organization. To be betrayed by Junta, Anselmi, and Scalise was a deep personal wound. And in the twisted psyche of a sociopath, rejected love turns instantly to homicidal rage. But Capone was disciplined. He didn't lash out immediately. He needed to be sure. He needed them to convict themselves. He arranged a test. A staged argument, a feigned moment of weakness where he lamented that the pressure was too much, an opportunity for them to show their hand. They took the bait. They became arrogant, believing the big shot was losing his grip. The confirmation was absolute. The order came down in Capone's mind, but it wasn't for a standard drive-by shooting. It wasn't for a quiet disappearance in the middle of the night. Capone wanted to send a message to God and the devil alike. He invited the three traitors to a banquet. The date was May 7, 1929. The location was a private room at the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero, the fortress from which Capone ruled his suburban fiefdom. The invitation was for a celebration. A feast to honor the loyalty of his top men, a night to relax after the stresses of the past few months. It was a classic Sicilian stratagem, one that dated back to the Roman Empire: embrace your enemy before you destroy him. Anselmi, Scalise, and Junta arrived dressed in their finest suits. They wore tuxedos, expecting a night of wine, food, song, and perhaps a promotion or a larger cut of the profits. They walked into the room believing they were the smartest men in Chicago. They believed their plot was still a secret, shadowed in darkness. They had no idea they were walking into a mausoleum prepared specifically for them. The room was dimly lit, filled with the smell of expensive Cuban cigars and heavy Italian cooking, garlic, tomato, roasted meats. Capone played the role of the jovial host perfectly. He was charming, magnetic, and loud. He poured the wine himself, a gesture of respect. He laughed at their jokes, slapping them on the back. He toasted to their health, looking them in the eye with a smile that didn't quite reach his own. The tension for the other men in the room, the loyalists like Frank Nitti, Jack McGurn, and Tony Accardo, must have been suffocating. They knew what was coming. They sat there, eating and drinking, watching the dead men walking. The traitors, however, were drunk on their own hubris. They ate the food Capone paid for, drinking the wine Capone poured, all while plotting to put a bullet in his back. They felt superior. They felt safe. As the night wore on and the plates were cleared, the atmosphere shifted. It happened slowly, then all at once. The music stopped. The laughter died down, replaced by a silence that stretched too long, a silence that became heavy and suffocating. Capone stood up at the head of the table. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by the cold, dead stare that had terrified a city. He began to speak. His voice was low, rumbling like an idling engine. He spoke of loyalty. He spoke of the importance of family. He spoke of the sacrifices he had made for the men at this table, how he had lifted them from the gutter and made them kings. He paced around the table, his eyes locking onto each of the three men. Then, he dropped the facade. He revealed that he knew everything. He threw their betrayal in their faces, listing the details of their plot with terrifying accuracy. He mentioned the meetings with Aiello, the money, the promises. The color drained from the faces of Anselmi, Scalise, and Junta. The wine turned to vinegar in their stomachs. They tried to stammer denials, to plead their innocence, but the room was already closing in. The bodyguards had moved from the walls, blocking the doors. There was no escape. Capone didn't reach for a gun. A gun was too impersonal. A gun was too quick. A bullet is over in a second, it doesn't allow for the expression of true fury. For a betrayal of this magnitude, for a threat that endangered his wife and son, he needed something primal. He reached under the table and produced a baseball bat. The violence that followed was not a fight, it was an execution. It was a slaughter. Capone, a man of immense physical strength and bulk, unleashed a hurricane of fury upon the three men. He didn't delegate this. He didn't look away. He struck them with the bat, over and over again. The sound was sickening, the crack of wood on bone, the dull thud of impact, the wet sounds of destruction. He beat them methodically. He broke their arms so they couldn't defend themselves. He broke their ribs. He shattered their collarbones. It was a release of all the pressure, all the paranoia, and all the fear he held for his family. He wanted them to feel his anger. He wanted them to know, in their final moments of consciousness, that this was personal. This wasn't business, this was retribution. It was a scene of medieval brutality in a modern age. The tuxedos were ruined, shredded and stained. The white tablecloths were splattered crimson. The fine china was smashed. When Capone was finally finished, panting and covered in sweat and blood, the three men were barely recognizable heaps on the floor, clinging to life by a thread. To ensure the job was finished, his bodyguards stepped forward and delivered the coup de grace with revolvers, ending their misery. But the message had already been delivered by the bat. Capone stood over them, the bat hanging from his hand. He had protected his throne. He had eliminated the threat. But now, the adrenaline was fading, and the reality of his life was waiting for him. The night was over. He had to go home. This is where the story shifts. Most gangster narratives end with the bodies being hauled away, dumped in a roadside ditch in Indiana. And indeed, the bodies of Anselmi, Scalise, and Junta were found later, beaten and shot, discarded like trash. But the true psychological horror of the Al Capone story lies in the domestic life that coexisted with this savagery. Capone left the hotel. He likely cleaned up, changed his clothes, washed the physical evidence of the massacre from his skin. He scrubbed the blood from his fingernails. But he couldn't wash away the energy of it. He traveled from the blood-soaked floors of Cicero to the quiet, tree-lined streets of his home on the south side. He walked through the front door of his house on Prairie Avenue. And waiting for him was May. May Capone is the enigma of this saga. She was Irish Catholic, middle-class, respectable. She was not a gun moll in the stereotypical sense. She didn't wear flashy jewelry or hang out in speakeasies. She went to church every Sunday. She raised their son, Sonny, with a fierce devotion. She kept a spotless house. She was polite to the neighbors. And on this night, like so many other nights, she was the barrier between Al Capone the monster and Al Capone the man. The media and the public often wondered, did she know? How could she not know? The answer is the unimaginable part of her character. She knew. She had to know. The newspapers were screaming it. The radio was broadcasting it. Her husband was the most famous killer in America. He was surrounded by armed men day and night. But May Capone performed a mental gymnastic routine that is almost terrifying in its discipline. She constructed a reality where Snorky was just a businessman in a rough trade, a provider who was misunderstood. On the night of the baseball bat murders, or nights very much like it, Al would come home carrying the weight of slaughter. His eyes would still hold the manic energy of the violence. And May's reaction was not to confront him. It was not to recoil in horror. It was not to demand a divorce. It was not to flee with Sonny to protect him from the crossfire or the moral rot. Her reaction was to serve him a warm meal. Her reaction was to ask about his day without expecting an answer. Her reaction was to smooth his hair and tell him to rest. This behavior goes beyond simple denial. It was an active participation in the maintenance of evil. By normalizing his domestic life, May gave Al Capone the one thing he couldn't steal and couldn't buy, absolution. When he walked through that door, the monster was left outside. Inside, he was a father and a husband. May validated his humanity. She allowed him to sleep at night. She absorbed his sins so he didn't have to carry them alone. The unimaginable act was her silence. In the days following the discovery of the bodies of the 3 traitors, the city was in an uproar. The brutality of the murders shocked even the hardened Chicago police. Everyone knew Capone did it. The gruesome details of the battered bodies were splashed across the front pages of the Chicago Tribune and the Daily News. May Capone read those papers. She saw the photos. She read the descriptions of the shattered bones that matched the work of a baseball bat, the same kind of bat her son might use in a sandlot game. And she did nothing. She went shopping. She took Sonny to school. She attended Mass and prayed to the Virgin Mary. She maintained the facade of the perfect American family with a steel will that rivaled AL's own toughness. This was her role in the criminal enterprise. She wasn't the driver, she wasn't the shooter, she was the camouflage. She made the monster look human. By refusing to acknowledge the blood, she helped him wipe it away. She was the calm eye of the hurricane, enabling the storm to rage around her. The slaughter of the traitors secured Capone's safety for a time, but the end was inevitable. The violence he unleashed brought too much heat. The federal government, unable to pin the murders on him due to lack of witnesses, went after the money. The tax evasion trial of 1931 was the beginning of the end. During the trial, May sat in the courtroom. She was the picture of dignity, shielding her face from the photographers with a fur collar, clutching her rosary beads until her knuckles turned white. She watched as the prosecutors laid out the empire of crime her husband had built. She heard the testimony about the millions of dollars, the gambling dens, the violence. She saw the evidence of the life she pretended didn't exist. And still, she stood by him. She played the part of the wronged wife, the victim of government overreach. When Al was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, the empire collapsed. The money stopped flowing in rivers and started trickling. The friends disappeared. The power vanished. Al was sent to Atlanta, and then to the newly opened Alcatraz, a fortress on a rock in the middle of San Francisco Bay. There, the syphilis he had contracted years earlier, a secret shame of his promiscuous youth, began to eat away at his mind. The terrifying warlord was reduced to a confused, raving invalid, terrified of needles and haunted by ghosts. And here is where May's role becomes even more profound. When Al was finally released in 1939, he was a broken man. He had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old child. He was no longer the king of Chicago. He was a dying man with a rotting brain. May took him to Florida, to their estate on Palm Island. For the next 8 years, until his death in 1947, May Capone became his nurse, his guardian, and his jailer. She shielded him from the world. When he would rant about imaginary enemies, she soothed him. When he would talk to men who had been dead for a decade, she nodded along. When he would try to go fishing in the swimming pool, casting a line into the chlorinated water, she guided him back inside, away from the prying eyes of neighbors or journalists who wanted a picture of the fallen king. She protected his legacy by hiding his disintegration. But there is a darker layer to this devotion. May Capone held the keys to the kingdom's history. She knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically and perhaps literally. She knew who had been paid off. She knew the secrets that could have brought down judges, politicians, and police captains. She knew the truth about the baseball bat. And she took it all to the grave. She lived for decades after Al died. She remarried, she moved, she tried to disappear into anonymity. But she never sold him out. She never wrote a tell-all book to cash in on the fame. She never gave an interview condemning the violence that had paid for her fur coats and her grand houses. She kept the secrets of the outfit better than the soldiers who had taken a blood oath. The story of the baseball bat dinner is often told as a testament to Al Capone's ruthlessness. It is the defining moment of his reign as a violent tyrant. It highlights his philosophy, loyalty or death. But the story is incomplete without looking at the other side of the coin. Al Capone slaughtered the men who threatened his family. He beat them to death with his own hands to ensure that May and Sonny would be safe from the wolves. He did it for power, yes, but he also did it for them. And in return, May gave him the ultimate gift. She gave him a home where he wasn't a murderer. What she did was unimaginable because it defies our understanding of morality. We want to believe that if we found out our spouse was a monster, we would leave. We would run. We would scream. May Capone did none of those things. She absorbed the violence into the fabric of their lives. She ironed the shirts that had been stained with gunpowder. She cooked the meals that fed the beast. Her reaction to the slaughter was to ensure that the blood never touched the carpet. She created a zone of silence so powerful that it allowed Al Capone to exist. Without May, perhaps the guilt would have consumed him. Without the sanctuary of his home, perhaps he would have cracked sooner. In the end, the rivals threatened the family, and Al destroyed them. But it was May who buried the truth. She was the final line of defense, not against the hitmen, but against the judgment of history. She cleaned the slate every single day. And that chilling, quiet complicity is the true horror story of the Capone household. The monster was real, but the woman who held his hand made him invisible. She proved that sometimes, the most terrifying thing a person can do is simply look the other way.